Good evening, Healing Truth Women's Ministry. Good evening, Lady McInnis. Thank you so much once again for the opportunity to talk about the babes in the Bible. So this evening we are actually going to talk about Jael. And I know that some of you may know something about her, but we're going to talk about Jael quite a bit. So we meet Jael in Judges chapter 4 and chapter 5. And there's not much said about her. There are a few verses, but it's very impactful, the verses that talk about Jael in Judges. So if you have your Bibles, just look at Judges chapter 4 and Judges chapter 5. Now we know in the time of the Judges, Israel was into the promised land, and time after time they would fall into sinfulness, and God would send various people to deliver them. So we know judges like Samson, we know judges like Samuel, he was the first judge. Gideon was a judge as well. So we know about that period. It was a pattern of sinfulness. When we get to talking about Jael, though, as it pertains to the time of the judges, she is rises to importance during the judgeship of Deborah. And I know the women on here, you know Deborah, or some people say Deborah, but Deborah, I say, was the judge at the time that we meet Jael. And Jael is actually a Kenite. And what are the Kenites? The Kenites are Canaanites. They were indigenous to the promised land, and they were the people that God said the Israelites had to destroy as they were going through the promised land. But for some reason, the Kenites, when Israel was coming into the promised land, they were helpful to Israel as they were traveling into the promised land. And so Saul decided to allow them to stay. Eventually they were not destroyed. So you have these Kenites that are living amongst the Israelites, and that's going to become important when we start talking about Jael. So the Kenites are there, and they are, of course, idol worshipers. So that would make Jael an idol worshiper. She is not an Israelite. So the context of this particular narrative where we meet Jael is that the Canaanites, and of course, you know, we refer to the promised land as the Canaan. And though it's called Canaan, there were different nations of people in the promised land. So there were the Kenites, there were the Israelites, there were the Canaanites, which is another tribe. There were the Cadmonites. So there were lots of different nations occupying the land that is known as the promised land, but most of us are mostly familiar with the Canaanites, and we think that Canaanites describes everybody, but it's not necessarily so. But nonetheless, during this reign of Deborah, the Canaanites, led by King Jabin, attacked Israel, of course, because of Israel's own sinfulness. So God sent Jabin and his army. The captain of his army is Sisera. And if you're familiar with the story, you know Sisera. So Sisera is the captain of the army. He has 900 chariots, and they are coming against the children of Israel. And Deborah is the judge, and Deborah calls on Barak. And all of these people will come into significance as we talk about Jael. So Deborah calls on Barak to come, and he is going to lead the army because, of course, as a woman, she's not going to lead the army. And, of course, that was par for the course then. That was just a cultural norm. Women did not go out to war. You just didn't do that. So Barak is going to lead the army, and he asks Deborah to go with him. We know this, and she says, okay. But when we come to Sisera, he is the captain of Jabin's army. And of course, the Lord fights for Israel in this battle. And we're in Judges chapter 4. The Lord fights for Israel in this battle. And Sisera and his army are defeated, completely destroyed. Sisera survives. And Sisera runs to Jael, and that's where we meet Jael, Miss Jael. He runs to the tent of this Kenite woman, and when he gets there, she welcomes him in, and we're going to go into some of the details. She welcomes him into her tent, and ultimately she kills him. Of course, there's a whole lot more to it because I'm going through it really fast, but we'll go through the details again. Now, I sort of skipped over this important part in Judges chapter 4. Deborah tells Barak that there's a prophecy related to this battle. And in this prophecy, and it's in Judges chapter 4, verse 9. It says, and she, meaning Deborah, I will surely go with thee, notwithstanding the journey that thou takest shall not be for thine honor. For the Lord shall sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. So already we see that God has a plan that ultimately is going to be fulfilled through Jael, this Gentile woman, which is important for us as Gentiles. We are Gentiles. We are not Jewish people. And so you see God already interspersing, using Gentile people to deliver Israel. So this Jael, she's a Gentile. She is a Kenite, as we said. Now, as you go through the narrative, what you find out is, of course, this woman, this Gentile woman, is ordained by God to bring deliverance to Israel. And it actually becomes a turning point in the battle because Sisera goes to her, she kills him. And once he's dead, the Israelites are able to rise up and overthrow Jabin, who had been persecuting them for over 20 years. And after they were able to overthrow Jabin, you have these 40 years of peace. So Jael's name actually translates to mountain goat. Yes, I know that's not a very feminine sounding name, but it is translated to mountain goat, which is talking about strength and power, agility. If you look at a mountain goat on the mountains, they're very nimble. They're able to move quickly in a very dangerous space, in a very dangerous place. The mountain sides are very sharp. They're very steep. The places where you can stand, there's not much space there, but the mountain goats are able to navigate in that hostile environment. So when you start thinking about Jael and her role in this narrative, you start to see how she fulfills the meaning of her name, mountain goat. And it's actually from a root word in the Hebrew, which means to gain, to profit, a good or profitable person. So we meet Jael, and we already see the prophecy that God himself is going to sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. When we meet Sisera, he's already beaten. His army is behind him. They're defeated. And he's running basically for his life. And he goes to a place that he thinks is safe. And the reason he thinks that this place is safe is Jael's husband has separated himself even from the Kenites, from the larger tribe of the Kenites. He separated himself from them, and he's living in very close proximity to where Deborah and Barak are in Kadesh, Naphtali. So his name is Heber. Yes, his name is Heber. He is living very close to them in Kadesh, separated from the Kenites, sort of isolated, and with his wife and of course his larger family. They're tent dwellers, so they're nomadic, but they may have settled at that point. He's not at home. Sisera shows up. He goes to a place that he thinks is safe because Heber had a pact, or he was friendly. He had a peaceful situation with Jabin, who was king of the Canaanites, oppressing Israel. So Sisera thinks, where can I go to be safe? I'm going to Heber's tent. I'm going to Heber's place where he's living. When he gets there, Heber's not there. Jael is there. Sisera figures, I can rest here. I'm going to be safe here. So he goes to Jael and he asks her to please let him into the tent. And we are on, still in Judges chapter 4. He shows up, 4 and 17. He shows up to her tent and she goes out to meet him and she says, come in. She welcomes him into the tent And he, of course, is exhausted emotionally. It's been a battle. Physically, he's beaten, thinking that he's on the verge of death. So he's just completely exhausted. You know when it is you're completely exhausted. So he comes into her tent, accepts this welcome, goes to a place where he thinks he's going to be safe, goes into her tent, and she covers him with a mantle, meaning some kind of covering. Where in verse 19, he asks her for something to drink. He asked her for water, but she gave him milk. And what's translated here is not, of course, milk like we think. It's probably not freshly, what's the word they use for milking cows? It's probably not freshly milked, fresh milk. What it is likely soured milk, which of course nomads ate. They didn't have refrigeration, so they stored milk, and of course it would get soured, but that they would drink it. It's sort of like yogurt, sort of like a kefir, if some of you are familiar with that. And of course back then it was probably slightly intoxicating because it was fermented, having been in this bottle for so long. It's milk. They're not pasteurizing milk and things like that. So she has this bottle of milk. He asks her for water. She gives him this bottle of soured, fermented, probably intoxicating milk, and he is knocked out. He lays down, the exhaustion, the milk, feeling like he's at rest, he's in a safe place. He is knocked out. And he says to her in verse 20, stand at the door and guard me. And if anyone comes asking for me, tell them that nobody is here. Basically, lie on my behalf to protect me. So while he's asleep, she decides, and we're not given much background as to why she makes this decision, but she decided, I'm going to take this tent nail. And of course, the tent nail is not like the nail that you think of now. It's more like a stake. So any of you who have gone camping, you know that it's something maybe in the vicinity of a foot long. It is about 12 inches, if not longer. And she takes this, he is knocked out in her tent. She takes it with a hammer, puts it against his temple, and hits this nail through his temple into the ground, and completely, he is dead. It's over. Sisera is dead. And of course, Barak, who is the head of Israel's army, he follows Sisera hard on his heels. When he gets to the tent, Jael again goes out, and she says to Barak, come, I have the man that you're looking for. Come and find him. He's in my tent. And Barak finds Sisera dead. And the end of this narrative is in verse 23. It says, so God subdued on that day Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the children of Israel. So if we're thinking about what can we learn from Jael, there's several things actually. So before we go to that point, let's talk about the fact that it is completely inappropriate for Sisera to go into a woman's tent, be she married or unmarried, completely outside of cultural norms. That is a violation of Heber. It is a violation of Jael. Whether or not his intent was to be sexual with her, that's not even on the table. But in terms of her reputation, in terms of what's culturally appropriate, in terms of what looks right, that's completely inappropriate for him to do that. That's the first egregious act on his part. And then to ask her to protect him. So he's asking her to go out there and stand guard over him. Again, that is completely inappropriate. That is not his wife, and it's a woman. Women are not supposed to be standing guard over men, even in that culture. I know that in our modern culture, people would probably say, well, what's wrong with it? Well, in that culture, no, that is completely inappropriate for him to ask her to protect him while he rests. And furthermore, that's not his wife. She does not belong to him. She's not of his family. That's completely outside of cultural mores for him to do that. But the thing is that he felt safe there. And so because he felt safe, he took liberties that he should not have taken at all. So we see Jael here. We're not given any reasons that she actually decided to kill him. But if we step back and look at the situation, what you see here is, as we said earlier, the situation with the Kenites. So the Kenites were a small group living in Israel. Israel had already taken over the promised land, and though there were other nations living there, Israel was still this big nation. The Kenites is a smaller group. Then Heber pulls himself away from the Kenites, and he's isolated. Now, as her husband, she possibly thought to herself, that's not the right thing for us to do. We are isolated. We are completely isolated here in the midst of Israel. Whomever attacks Israel, you're going to have to take a side. You will have to take a side. And so Jael made a decision here. I'm going to take the side of Israel. She's going to take the side of Israel, because look at it on the other side. Had she sided with Sisera, Sisera is one man. When Barak showed up with his 10,000 soldiers, because that's the army that he pulled together at God's instruction. When Barak shows up with his 10,000 soldiers and finds Sisera in her tent, what do you think happens to Jael? What do you think happens to her entire household? What do you think happens even to her husband that was peaceful with Jabin? They're all annihilated. So that was a strategic decision on Jael's part to protect her household, to side with Israel in this battle, to make sure that Israel survives. Even though her husband was in league with the Canaanites, she made a decision. And so we've had several conversations about other women, and this should sort of prompt you to start thinking about Abigail, who made a similar kind of decision. She said, listen, I know my husband made one decision as far as David was concerned, but I recognize here that that was not the right decision, and I have to do something to protect my household. And so we see Jael here making a similar kind of strategic decision. She's going to do something to protect herself, her husband, and her entire household. So she did that, and she killed him. The way that she killed him now, she again had to be strategic. When he showed up to her tent, she welcomed him in. She did not try to battle with him. Again, though it was completely inappropriate for him to go into her tent, she was not about to fight with this man. She saw an opportunity to end all of this battle, to protect her household. So she welcomed him in. She made him feel comfortable. And when he felt comfortable, he asked her to lie for him. And she was, okay, I'll do all these things that you're asking me to do. Here's this lovely sour milk so you can rest and be even more intoxicated and more tired. So we have to be strategic in our approach. She did not have the physical strength to battle with Sisera. She didn't have that physical strength. So she had to use what she had available. And what she had available was to be welcoming, to have him come in and rest in that space, to give him that milk, to get him to a place where he is completely vulnerable. Now we see that, I know it sort of sounds like we're using womanly wiles, but it's not womanly wiles. These are the skill sets that we have. This is what we have available. We can't go toe to toe with any man and attempt to overthrow and fight him. That's not going to work. We're just not physically built for that. And so we have to use the skills that we have. Men use the skills that they have. They have muscle, they have brawn. We use the skills that we have, which is strategic thinking. So that's what Jael did. Now, when we see again, Sisera asked for refreshment. He asked for water, but she gave him that sour milk. That again is her strategy. So, certainly we're not saying that anybody should go out there and try to kill their enemy or kill the person whom they feel is potentially going to attack them. No, we're not talking about that. So if we were moving this forward as modern day believers to figure out what can we learn from a Jael, again, we have to be strategic thinkers. As we are modern day believers, we understand that our enemies, whomever we perceive to be our enemy, whoever is potentially about to jeopardize us and our household, our husbands, our children, we also understand, we put that in the context of scripture that says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So as modern believers, we understand clearly that no enemy, no person that you're looking at, no flesh and blood person, no matter what they're doing to you, that person is not your enemy. They may be used by the enemy, who is Satan, the deceiver, that slanderer. They may be used by him, but understand that that person is not your enemy. And so once we get that in our heads, once we understand, we make that distinction between flesh and blood person and the spirit behind it, the spiritual being behind it, because that's what Satan is. He is a spirit being. That spirit being behind it, if we even acknowledge that it's sin working in that person's flesh. So when Paul talks to us about we who are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak, you're strong in the spirit. Take that moment, don't act in haste, and recognize that the spirit that's working behind that person, or even sin in their flesh, that is what's happening there. Don't attack the person. So again, keep in mind, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So we make that distinction. And then, because we know that, then we can be strategic. We can be strategic just like Jael was strategic. You try to salvage the relationship with the person, with the flesh and blood person. You work to maintain that person's salvation, to preserve that person's soul, so that you, as the stronger, you can bring that person to Christ. You can talk to them about salvation. Don't attack people, whether they're believers or unbelievers. That is not the place of a spiritually strong person. That is not our role. So once again you make that distinction, the next part is this, to understand that the weapons, again, this is Paul talking to us. Jael's weapon was her strategic mind, but then she took a hammer and a nail to destroy this man Sisera. Our weapons, the weapons of our warfare, are not carnal, but they are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds and putting out imaginations and any high thing that exalted itself against the knowledge of God. So when, here's the thing with us. It requires modern believers to be vulnerable. We must be vulnerable because we cannot take up swords. Yes, we cannot take up swords. We cannot use guns, no physical weapons, and certainly we should not be using the weapons of our tongues, because we know some of us, these tongues, oh my. And we use every other, we use those same womanly wiles against people, mind you, but we'll put that aside for a moment. We use our tongues against people. So no weaponry, none of the carnal weapons. And just because we're saying carnal weapons, understand that carnal weapons are more than just the physical weapons. It's those intellectual weapons, it's that tongue, it's spitefulness, it's manipulation. All of that is weapon. All of those are weapons, and we're not to use any of those. So when we do use the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. What are our weapons? What are our weapons? The adornment of a meek and humble spirit. And I know you probably don't want to hear that, but that is what our weaponry is. So when Jael was able to welcome him in, she was not brash. She wasn't fighting against this man, but a meek, humble, welcoming spirit was able to bring this man in and strategically put him in a place where she could end up getting the victory over him. So just like us, we must be adorned, particularly women, but all believers, don't get me wrong, but since I'm mostly talking to women tonight, a meek spirit, humility, a soft answer turns away wrath. Yes? Be forgiving. Yes? Be spiritually minded. Have the fruit of the Spirit. Operate in your spiritual gifts. Prayer. Let me say it one more time. Prayer is the weapon That is the weapon that we use. And it is, you look at prayer and you say, is that really going to work? I remember having a conversation where people said, oh, we're just going to pray. Is that all we're going to do? And I said, wait a minute. That's the wrong attitude. If we as believers are going to say just pray, well, then what are we leaving for the unbelievers? We have to understand that prayer is made mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. When we engage with God on behalf of some situation, some person, that is made mighty through God to pull down strongholds. Do you know that you reinforce the strongholds in people's minds when we attack them? When we think that we're using logic and reason and all those other things, that is only reinforcing the stronghold. But when you are meek and you yield and you're welcoming and you are allowing people space and you're compassionate and you show love, all of these things break down the strongholds. Because when you attack people, it causes them to try to strengthen and reinforce their strongholds, reinforce themselves against your attack. But if you yield, they have to yield too, because there's no need to hold up that embattlement, right? Just like Joshua walked around the walls, the people in Jericho knew that he was coming, but they didn't attack them right away. They just walked around walls. So the people in Jericho didn't know what to do. Like, why aren't they attacking? God had a plan. So just like we should, just like JL, be meek and humble, welcoming, and use those womanly wiles, then you too will be able to conquer those enemies. And whomever, again, you perceive to be your enemy, remember, it's not flesh and blood. It is not flesh and blood. It is the principalities and it is the powers. So we have to keep that in mind and remember that our weapons are not carnal, but they are mighty through God to pull down the strongholds so that we can have the effect that God wants us to have. We don't fight the way other people fight. We ought not to. We ought to have put down all of those old ways and become that new creature that the Bible talks to us about. So Jael has some important lessons for us to see how she was strategic in her thinking, how she was welcoming to this man who was breaching all sorts of decorum. And I want us to also keep in mind as we having, because you see this relationship between this woman, Jael, and Sisera, and he was breaching certain cultural norms. So for us, even as modern believers, in your relationships with a man, and I'm speaking to single women particularly, even to married ones, you have a man here who's saying to the woman, give me. And he's saying to her, you protect me. You stand guard and watch over me. And that is not ever a woman's space. That is not our space, and it is not our place. We are to be sheltered. We are not to be the protectors. We are to be protected. So for single women, a man comes to you immediately and he starts talking about, give me. That's not the right one for you. That is not the Christ-like model. We see Jesus Christ coming to give. We see God even so loved the world that he gave. So love is synonymous with giving. If a man wants to be with you, he should come with gifts. When I say gifts, I'm not talking just material gifts, but he should have that attitude, that posture that he wants to give. He wants to be a gift to you, and he wants to be protected. He wants to protect you. He's not looking for you to protect him, and furthermore, ask you to lie about it too. So as believers, again, we're looking for that standard in a man that looks like Jesus Christ. And of course, no man is perfect. No man is perfectly like Christ. Neither are we as women perfectly like Christ. But you want to at least know that he understands what he should be striving for, and that he's aiming for that. He's working toward that. The first battle, the first hurdle is, what is his understanding of his role? And of course, all of these things come out in conversations. And if you have counsel with senior women, your first lady, if you have Lady Cynthia McInnis, as your pastor's wife, your first lady, your shepherd mother, your Dr. Lady McInnis. I'm sure that she would give you wise counsel on how to be selective and to use biblical criteria as you're selecting a spouse. So Miss JL is interesting. She is important. She is strong. She's able to do what she needed to do to get the job done. And she was used by God, ordained by God to bring deliverance to Israel. So I hope that you enjoyed today's session, and hopefully we'll see you all next Wednesday. Have a great day. Thanks.